The boy ate the candle wax because there was nothing else. Miriam Sutter found him at the kitchen table before dawn, scraping the last of the tallow from the candle holder with his fingernails and putting it in his mouth with the focused determination of a child who'd stopped caring about taste and only cared about the empty thing screaming in his belly. He was 8 years old, and his name was Jonah, and when he looked up at his mother, he didn't cry. He was past crying. Crying took energy, and energy came from food, and there hadn't been food in this house for 3 days. "Mama, it doesn't taste bad if you don't think about it," Jonah said, and Miriam felt something inside her chest snap like a bone. She took the candle stub from his hands and pulled him against her. Behind her, in the bedroom, she could hear her daughter Colette coughing, the dry, persistent cough of a 5-year-old whose body was starting to eat itself because nobody was feeding it. Miriam Sutter had not eaten in 4 days. She'd given her last portions to the children, half a potato split between them, a handful of dried corn, the end of a flour sack mixed with water and fried into something that barely qualified as food. She'd watched them eat, wearing the careful mask that said everything is fine, when everything was the opposite of fine. Her husband Earl had left 7 weeks ago, not died, left. Walked out one October morning with his rifle and the money jar from the shelf above the stove and said he was going to find work at the mines. He'd send money, he said, 2 weeks at most. He'd kiss the children and walk down the road, and Miriam had watched him disappear and known, with the cold certainty of a woman who'd spent 6 years learning the rhythm of her husband's lies, that he wasn't coming back. The money jar had held $14, their insurance against winter. Earl had taken it the way he'd taken everything in their marriage. Casually, completely, without awareness that his actions had consequences for anyone but himself. Miriam had managed for 5 weeks on what remained. The garden was spent. The chickens sold to pay their debt at the general store, where credit dried up the moment word spread that Earl Sutter had abandoned his family. The cow traded for a sack of flour that lasted 4 days. She'd stripped the house of everything sellable and converted it to food that disappeared faster than she could replace it. Now there was nothing left to sell and nothing left to eat. "Get dressed," she told Jonah. "Both of you, warm as you can. Where are we going?" "Hunting." She'd never hunted in her life. But Earl had left his old shotgun, and there were rabbits in the brush along the creek, and deer in the timber if you went far enough. The November morning was bitterly cold. Miriam carried Colette on her hip because the girl's legs were too weak for the walk. Jonah trudged beside her, carrying the shotgun with the solemn responsibility of a boy who understood this wasn't a game. They walked east toward the creek, Miriam scanning frozen brush for movement while her empty stomach cramped and her arms shook from the weight of her daughter. They'd been walking nearly an hour when Jonah stopped and pointed, not at a rabbit, at something larger, darker, crumpled against the base of a cottonwood tree. "Mama, what is that?" Miriam set Colette down and raised the shotgun. The shape was too big for an animal, too still for a person, and yet movement. A hand lifting weakly from the ground, then falling back. "Stay here. Hold your sister." She approached slowly. The shape resolved into a man, sprawled on his back in frozen grass, one leg bent at a wrong angle, his coat dark with blood concentrated around his left side. His face was gray-white, his eyes closed. A horse stood nearby, reins trailing, nosing at the ground. Miriam pressed her fingers to his throat. Pulse, faint, rapid, but there. "Mister, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, blue, startlingly blue against the pallor. "Shot," he rasped. "Two men. Took my cattle. Left me." He tried to lift his head and couldn't. Horse came back. Miriam looked at the wound. The bullet had gone through his left side below the ribs. The bleeding had slowed, but the flesh around it was angry and swollen. She looked at her children. She looked at the dying man. She looked at the saddlebags on his horse. The calculation was simple and brutal. She could walk away, take whatever was in those saddlebags, and feed her children tonight. Nobody would know. In a world where her children were eating candle wax, the moral math of survival had no room for charity. Miriam waved Jonah over. "We're taking him home." Getting a half-conscious man onto a horse with only an 8-year-old for help was the hardest physical thing she'd ever done. The stranger was tall and heavy, dead weight against her shoulder. Twice she nearly went down under him before Jonah braced himself against the horse's other side and pushed. The man groaned and cursed and apologized for cursing. Eventually they got him across the saddle, and Miriam led the horse home with one hand on the reins and the other on the stranger's belt. She carried Colette with her free arm, the muscles in her back screaming. Jonah walked beside the horse, one small hand keeping the stranger steady. She got him inside onto the narrow bed and went to work. Cut away his shirt, cleaned the wound with boiled water, picked out dirt and fabric. The bullet had passed through. The exit wound was ugly but meant nothing to dig out. She packed both wounds with clean cloth strips, bound them tight, covered him with every blanket in the house. His name was Declan Marsh. He ran cattle south of the territory line. 2 men had jumped him, driven off his herd, shot him, and left him for dead. He'd been lying by that cottonwood for 2 days. "I'm going to check your saddlebags," Miriam told him during the lucid moment. "Take whatever you need. You're saving my life." The saddlebags held jerky, 2 thick strips she cut into pieces and divided between the children before he finished his sentence. A sack of cornmeal, coffee, a tin of biscuits, a leather wallet containing $38. She fed the children first. Jonah chewed slowly, making each bite last. Colette shoved biscuit into her mouth with both hands and cried when told to slow down. Miriam forced herself to eat a strip of jerky, her shrunken stomach cramping at real food. Then she made broth and spooned it between Declan's cracked lips. He managed half a cup before exhaustion took him. That first night she sat beside his bed and watched him breathe. His fever spiked after sundown, and she spent hours cooling his face with wet cloths. In the next room, her children slept with full stomachs for the first time in days. And inside Miriam's chest, the wire-tight determination that had kept her standing loosened just enough to let her feel how close they'd come. She'd been ready to rob a dying man. For a moment by the creek, she'd calculated the weight of his saddlebags against the hunger in her children's bellies. The fact that she hadn't walked away didn't feel like goodness. It felt like stubbornness, the refusal to become the kind of person this life was trying to turn her into. Declan's fever broke on the third day. The first thing he saw was Colette sitting on the floor beside his bed, drawing on a slate. "Hello," he said. "You were yelling in your sleep," Colette informed him. "Mama said it was the fever. I think you were having a bad dream." He turned his head and found Miriam in the doorway. "Mrs. Sutter, you look worse than I feel." "That's generous. You look terrible." He smiled, and it changed his whole face. "I understand you saved my life. I dragged you onto a horse and poured water on your wounds. You saved your own life by being too stubborn to die." His eyes moved around the room, taking in what the fever had hidden. Bare shelves, empty pegs, the thinness of the blankets, every blanket in the house on his bed, which meant the family had been sleeping cold so he could sleep warm. "Your husband," he said carefully. The children mentioned him. "He left 7 weeks ago, took our savings. And you've been alone since then, with nothing. We've been managing. Your boy was eating candle wax the morning you found me." Declan's voice was quiet but unflinching. "That's not managing. That's starving." The truth sat between them. Miriam found herself too tired for pretense. "Yes, we were starving." "Then let me help. When I'm well enough. You don't owe us anything, and decent people don't ride off and leave the woman who saved them to starve through winter." He shifted against the pillows. "I had 60 head of cattle before those men jumped me. I'll get them back or earn their value. Either way, I can help you." Miriam studied him. She'd been lied to for 6 years, charming lies that tasted sweet and turned to poison. She'd learned to distrust promises. But Declan wasn't charming, wasn't easy. He was direct in a way that left no room for deception. "Get better first," she said. "Then we'll talk." He got better slowly. The wound healed clean, which Miriam credited to stubbornness and Declan credited to her care. During those bedridden weeks, the $38 from his saddlebags kept them alive. Miriam rode to town on Declan's horse, a big gray gelding named Hatchet, who tolerated her inexperienced handling with saintly patience, and bought flour, beans, salt, coffee, and a small bag of sugar that made Colette squeal when she saw it. She was careful with the money, stretching each dollar the way frontier women learned to stretch everything. And when Declan asked for an accounting, she presented it with the precision of a woman who'd been tracking every cent. "You spent $9 feeding 3 people for 2 weeks, Declan said, looking at her figures. "That's remarkable. That's poverty. You learn to stretch things when the alternative is going without. It's a skill, and it's one I could use." He set the paper aside and looked at her with the expression she was learning to recognize, the one that meant he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for days. "I'm serious about helping, Mrs. Sutter. I've been lying in this bed thinking about what happens when I leave. You'll be right back where you started. That doesn't sit right with me. And what exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership. This land has good water, decent grass. What it needs is livestock and labor. I'll work this place through winter, get it producing again. In spring, I'll recover my cattle or buy new ones. We split the profits. And where do you sleep? The barn, once I'm well enough. I'm not proposing anything improper. I'm proposing a business arrangement between two people who each have something the other needs. Miriam thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it while she changed Declan's bandages, with hands growing more confident each day. She thought about it while Jonah sat at Declan's bedside and peppered him with questions about cattle and horses, questions the boy had been saving up for months because Earl had never had the patience to answer them. She thought about it while Colette drew picture after picture of Hatchet and left them on Declan's pillow like gifts. On the 4th day she said yes. Once he could stand without swaying, Declan threw himself into the work with the intensity of a man repaying a debt he considered sacred. He fixed the fence, repaired the chicken coop, and acquired 4 hens through a trade involving a broken saddle and what Miriam suspected was an exaggerated account of his injury. He split wood until the pile was taller than Jonah. When Miriam pointed out he was supposed to be recovering, he said he recovered better with busy hands. The truth was, Declan didn't know how to be still. He'd been working since he was 12. Cattle drives, ranch labor, anything that kept his hands occupied. He'd built his herd from nothing over 8 years, and losing those 60 head had been like losing 8 years of his life in a single afternoon. If he stopped moving long enough to think about it, the anger would swallow him. So he worked, and Miriam watched him, and something she hadn't expected began to happen. The cabin, which had felt like a trap for 7 weeks, the place where her marriage had died and her children had starved, started to feel like something else entirely. The fence stood straight. The woodpile grew. The hens produced eggs that Miriam scrambled for breakfast. Colette stopped coughing. Jonah stopped stealing food because there was food to eat without stealing. One morning, Miriam found Declan teaching Jonah to mend a harness in the barn. The boy was concentrating with fierce intensity, his small hands mimicking Declan's movements with the care of someone learning something sacred. Declan was patient in a way that Earl had never been, explaining each step, letting Jonah make mistakes and fix them himself, praising the effort rather than the result. When Jonah finally got the stitch right, Declan put a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "That's good work," and Jonah's face lit up with something Miriam hadn't seen in months, maybe years. She turned away before either of them could see her cry. Declan ate with them in the evenings because Miriam got tired of carrying plates to the barn. The first time he sat at the table, Jonah stared at him with an expression half suspicion, half desperate hope. "You're not going to leave," Jonah said, not a question. Declan met the boy's eyes. "I'm not going to leave. My pa said that too." Miriam opened her mouth to intervene, but Declan held up a hand slightly. "Your pa made a promise he didn't keep. I understand why that makes you careful. You're smart to be careful." He paused. "I won't make you a promise, Jonah. I'll just stay, and you can decide for yourself whether that's enough." Jonah considered this, then picked up his fork and started eating, the closest thing to acceptance he could give. December came and the real cold settled in. Declan had sealed gaps in the walls, reinforced the door, banked earth against the foundation to keep the floors warmer. They fell into a rhythm that felt natural in a way that surprised them both. Miriam managing the household, Declan handling the heavy labor and teaching Jonah to handle an axe and ride hatchet. Skills the boy absorbed with the fierce hunger of a child who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of attention. Colette, who was 5 and understood the world in simpler terms, adopted Declan the way she adopted everything she loved, completely, without reservation, with the absolute certainty that he belonged to her now, and any discussion of the matter was unnecessary. She drew pictures of him at the table, holding an axe, sitting on hatchet, standing next to Miriam. In every picture he was smiling, which Miriam found interesting because in real life Declan smiled rarely. But Colette drew the man she saw when nobody else was watching, the one whose face softened when he read to her at bedtime, the one who carried her on his shoulders through the snow so her boots wouldn't get wet, the one who'd started calling her little bird without seeming to realize he'd done it. Some evenings, after the children were in bed, Miriam and Declan sat by the fire and talked. Not always about practical things. Miriam told him about Ohio, about teaching school, about the girl she'd been before she'd married a man who'd slowly dismantled her belief in her own judgment. Declan told her about his life on the trail, cattle drives from Texas to Montana, years of sleeping on the ground and eating dust and saving every dollar toward the herd that had been his only dream until 2 men with guns had taken it away. "You don't talk about family," Miriam observed one night. "Don't have any. Mother died when I was 10. Father drank himself into the ground by the time I was 12. After that, it was just me and whatever work I could find." "You've been alone your whole life." "I've been self-sufficient," Declan corrected. Then, after a pause, "But I'm learning there's a difference." One evening they sat sorting seed catalogs, arguing about corn versus wheat, when Declan went quiet. "What is it?" "Letter from the territorial marshal. They found my cattle, about 40 head, scattered across 2 counties. The men who took them sold some, lost others. Marshals holding what they recovered." "That's good news." "It means I have the start of a herd again, enough to rebuild, enough to—" He stopped. "Enough to move on," Miriam finished. The silence had weight. 2 people realizing the arrangement they'd been calling temporary had become something neither wanted to end. "I could take the cattle south," Declan said. "Find my own land. That would be the sensible thing." "Probably." He looked at her across the firelight. "I don't want to do the sensible thing, Miriam." It was the first time he'd used her name. The sound of it made her pulse quicken in a way she hadn't felt in years. "What do you want to do?" "I want to bring those 40 head here, run them on this land, build the herd back up, teach your boy everything I know, watch your girl grow up somewhere safe." His voice roughened. "And I want to sit across from you at this table every evening for as long as you'll let me, not as a business partner." Miriam thought about Earl. his easy promises, his charming lies. She thought about candle wax at 5 in the morning, and she thought about Declan, who'd arrived half dead and repaid her kindness by fixing every broken thing he could find, the fence, the coop, the woodpile, and something inside Miriam herself that she hadn't realized was broken until it started working again. "Bring the cattle here," she said. He left on Monday, riding toward the marshal's office 60 miles south. Miriam stood on the porch, Colette on her hip, Jonah beside her with his jaw set against the question of whether this was like the last time, when a man rode down that road and never came back. 12 days later, Jonah came running from the ridge at full sprint. "Mama, he's coming. I can see the cattle." She dropped the laundry and ran. From the ridge she could see them, a dusty column of animals moving up the valley, 40-odd head driven by a single rider. Declan sat tall in the saddle, scanning the horizon until he found the cabin and the figures on the ridge. He raised one hand. Miriam raised hers. Jonah looked up at his mother. "Mama, are you happy?" Miriam watched the cattle stream into the valley that was about to become their future. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm happy." They were married in the spring in the front room of the cabin Declan had repaired and Miriam had made into a home. Jonah held the ring. Colette threw dried wildflowers. Hatchet watched through the window and sneezed during the vows, which Colette said meant the horse approved. It wasn't the life Miriam had expected. It was better, not easier. Nothing on the frontier was easy, but built on honesty instead of charm, on showing up instead of promising to, on the quiet daily proof that love wasn't something you said, it was something you did, with your hands and your time and your stubborn refusal to ride away when staying was harder. Declan Marsh stayed. Every single day he stayed, and that was worth more than any promise ever made.